Yes. Welcome to Chatting Up the Chick. This is episode 13. We are indeed in Cluckingham Palace, the usual place for Chris Chick banter. Well, it's not so much banter today. I was musing again, it's my new favourite word, after doing the last episode on the plastic problem and saying no to plastic. And I thought to myself, one thing about life, when you really stick yourself in deep, you start to realise how much suffering there is. Now, I'm not. I just want to start off by saying there's levels of suffering in this world, and we can't deny that different people suffer in different ways, different sizes of suffering. Uh, Something that may happen to me that doesn't affect me could happen to someone else, and they could suffer immensely for it. Obviously, people are starving and dying every day. Like we could just opening the whole concept of suffering is the Pandora's box to start off with. But what I wanted to talk about was, is suffering necessary? Is suffering necessary? Is it something that we as humans have to endure as part of life? Or is there a way to mitigate suffering? My obvious answer is no, unless you're some sort of a socio-psychopath type person who feels no empathy. And if one of your because inevitably one of your family members is going to die, and if you're not going to have some sort of suffering from someone else's death, then you're not 100% within the realms of healthy mentalness. If that's the right word to use. It's a type of mental illness to not feel empathy for your other human being. But then people will argue, well, what's the basis for that? But I'm not even going to go down that path, because that's another path that just gets absolutely grey in matter completely. But yeah, so I was kind of thinking about whether suffering was actually something that we must go through in this world as part of our journey. The reason I started thinking about that was, it was a two-pronged thing. First of all, I was thinking about my own journey in the sense of trying to do the best I can in this world, not only for myself, but more importantly for other people. And the whole idea of the plastic problem, remember, go back and listen. Episode 12, Chatting Up a Chick. You'll love it. If you don't, then it's only 15 minutes long. You won't lose much of your life going back and listen to it. But the part of the journey I've had is I realise the deeper you get in, the more you suffer. Now, when I say suffer, I mean mentally suffer. Like I find myself being in situations where I'll be in like the supermarket, and I'll be making a concerted effort to make sure that all the products that I'm buying have no plastic associated to them. If you've listened to my podcast before, you'll find out that that is almost impossible. And obviously, I'm not going to give away the podcast, but the take home point is we need to get rid of using all those single use plastics. But being in the supermarket and walking around, and I see people like here in New Zealand, like we did a great job by getting rid of single use plastic bags. Good start, love it, bang. Like I must admit, at the time, I was I didn't really get into the euphoria of the whole plastic ban, but looking back now, I'm so glad it happened. But still, you go into a supermarket and they still have plastic bags that you can put your fruit and veg in. And so I'm walking around the supermarket and I just see people with like one sweet potato or a kumara in one of these plastic bags. And I'm thinking, why? Just don't use the plastic. Just have it loose. Like it drives me mad to the point. And I'm thinking to myself, am I creating more suffering for myself by what I see other people doing? Now, I can't help but feel the suffering because of the place I find myself at. But I have no moral obligation to start telling other people what they should and shouldn't be doing with their own personal life. Like, I would love it if people just didn't use plastic, but I have to suffer the reality that they are going to use plastic. And that's when I start getting myself into, I wouldn't say dark places because that's kind of conjuring up some real dark thoughts, but I get myself into dark places where I think to myself, oh, well, what's the point? What's the point? Why? I might as well just give up now. There's no point even continuing if no one else is going to jump on that bandwagon. And that's where community comes into play because I've realized that I'm not the only person trying to go plastic free. Um, and there's plenty of people out there that are doing it. And they're probably going through exactly the same emotions that I'm going through. But they're doing it, and that gives me hope. That gives me motivation to keep going and keep going and keep going. So I think from that context, the suffering that I do feel, I think is necessary. Like, I think it's necessary for me to keep that suffering there as a reminder of how important the process is, if that makes sense. Again, in the grand scheme of things, it seems quite trite to call it suffering because I'm not in a position where I'm foraging for food, or I'm not in a position where I'm watching my friends, family die of curable diseases because the water that I get has is contaminated. Like I'm not in that kind of suffering is avoidable and it should be changed. And we should be um, doing everything within our power to make sure that there's people around the world getting clean water and they're getting the food and nutrition that they need. Like that's a suffering that just has to be eliminated. Um, for me, the suffering I'm talking about, it's a luxury to say that that's a suffering because again, in the grand scheme of things, it's not as bad as it sounds. But I can paint a picture of what the world would look like in 50 years if we don't actually take um, a, a, con- an effort to actually start cleaning up this planet. The second thing I want to say about suffering is I believe suffering comes from a place of trauma. Um, the only reason we as humans continue to suffer is because we've never dealt with the trauma within our life. Now, that could come from childhood trauma, could come from physical trauma, um, whatever it might be, but we haven't actually internalized the trauma that's happened in our life to the point where we can deal with it and move on. I'll give you a great example. When I was 22, my mother passed away with brain cancer. Now it was looking back now, I can speak cavalierly about it because I've dealt with it. I've dealt with the pain and the suffering that I was going through at the time, which made it very difficult for me to talk about it. But I remember my mum being in a position where she couldn't help herself. She was more or less in a vegetative state, even though she was coherent to some degree. And I just carried on like it was just part and parcel of life, when obviously it's not. It's something horrendous, and I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. If I was gonna be truthful, looking back, I wish my mum would have died, because she did actually clinically die during surgery for the tumor. I wish she would have not recovered from that, uh, knowing what I know now, that she spent the next year in such a horrible physical and mental state. Like, I couldn't even go into her mental state, because I wasn't mature enough to actually have those conversations. I wish I was mature enough. But anyway, after this part of my life transpired, I decided to go to university. In one way, that was a good thing. In another way, it was a bad thing. But I never dealt with that trauma of watching my own mother die in such a horrendous way, where got to the point where she was just in such a vegetative state. It just wasn't my mum. It was alien to me. Anyway, by the third year of university, I'd pushed everything to the back, and I became such an angry and violent young man that I lost a lot of friends, and rightly so, because I was a horrible person to be around. It wasn't until let's say 7, 8 years later, when I got into my early 30s, that I actually took the time to internalize the trauma that I went through, and actually made a concerted effort to understand why it happened and what it created. Now, I have no answers to why my mum got brain cancer and why she died. I don't know. There's too many variables in this world that created that. That could go back hundreds of years. Now, what we know about genetics now, where um, trauma can be passed on from generation to generation to generation, that explains a lot. That's why we're in such a mess that we're in as human beings right now. That we create our own violence through the trauma that's come from generations before. Um, it's important that we take the time to actually internalize that and be able to break free of it. That, I believe, is one of the big reasons why we as a human race suffer more than we need to. Doesn't mean we're going to stop suffering. Definitely not. You know, there's going to be a point in my life where people who I'm close to are no longer going to be here. It's already happened once with my mum. But I'm in a better place now to understand that it's part of life. Suffering is the part of life. And there's nothing wrong with embracing that suffering. It's how you internalize it and how you move forwards from that suffering that's very important. Hey guys, look, I'm just got myself lost into a complete tangent there. I guarantee the next episode. What's an episode? Who knows? The next episode I do will be light-hearted. I'll probably do it on, I know, Manchester United and how rubbish they are at football right now. Because let's be fair, they are rubbish, and I've got so many Manchester United fans, and I'd love them to listen to it. And maybe Arsenal as well. I'll throw some Arsenal in there, just for me brother. Even if you probably won't listen to this anyway. You have a fantastic day. You look after yourselves. You make sure you give lots of loving. Show that love to the world out there. You've been listening to Chris the Chick. This has been Chatting Up the Chick. Yes, from Cluckingham Palace. Wickeder. Whee!